Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I am quite delighted to welcome you all here, both physically and virtually, to all those watching on YouTube, for the launch of The Vanishing Signs, essays by Gail Scott, which I would hold up if I had a copy. So you are welcome to applaud the invisible book. This, of course, features a reading and conversation hosted by Irene Bindi. Rest assured, you'll only have to tolerate my presence for just a moment, and then we'll move on to the actual interesting subject matter of the evening. I feel particularly jubilant to be hosting this event. Not only is Cam a dear friend, but someone whose work, presence, and brain all bring me great joy. He is someone generous of mind and spirit whose approach to thought and to the world regularly and dramatically reprogram my own perception. And this collection of essays itself is an act of generosity on the part of ARP, who I single out as a publisher, as Cam would likely dismiss that statement immediately in a solidly self-effacing manner. As someone who has printed out his work over the years to keep in a moldering manila folder underneath my desk, having these pieces collected in a volume handsomely designed and laid out by Scott Fitzpatrick and Relish New Brand Experience is a great boon to all those who seek, in the words of Matthew Stabler, to extract a possible future from the recent past and to find, in the words of Toby Hazlitt, those works both powerfully elegant and thick with thought. And his words are invariably thorny, rich, elegantly edgy in their thinking. As per the official publicity blurb, these discrete and overlapping studies are excerpted from the activity of a politically interested readership for whom literature makes real demands of the one world that it describes. Its author, Gail Scott, is a poet, critic, and non-musician from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory. His poetry collection, Romans/SNOWMARE, also published by ARP, is both a daybook of anti-capitalist ideation and a homoerotic reinvention of the prairie lawn poem, as it resonates with the love of language and experiment. A chapbook, Wrestlers, was published by Grain Ghost in 2017. He is also the artistic director of the Sound Art Festival Send and Receive, which kicks off this coming week here in Winnipeg. Irene Bindi is an artist and you may applaud, Cam. Irene Bindi is an artist and an editor at ARP Books. She lives and works in Winnipeg. That is her humbly discreet bio. Suffice to say, Irene is one of those people whose presence or involvement with any project is an immediate imprimatur of quality. She is a rich and subtle thinker in addition to her visual work, a canny and wide-ranging sound artist, cinephile, and tireless activist. It's a huge honor for me to be able to ask you all to join me in welcoming these two fine folks to our stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, John, and everyone for being here, and Cam for asking me to be part of this discussion. This is fun because we've been working on this book for a couple of years now. It's not that fun to be in front of an audience, but it is fun to talk about this particular work. So I just want to start by saying in ARP's list of, like, I would say many unusual books, this is likely one of the more unusual among them. So I just wanted to start by kind of drawing out a distinction, because on the back of this book, it says essays and literary criticism. And when I look at this book as literary criticism, it is in like the least conventional and non-academic sense. And I don't mean, like, when I say non-academic, I don't mean written to a general readership necessarily, you know, whatever that might be. And I also don't mean written without language that is in common parlance, because there's an obvious like love of language and words and sonorants in all of Hocquenhem's work. But I mean the way that literary criticism is conceived within academia as part of its own kind of well-tread, broader historical narrative, and the kinds of normalized approaches, the analysis of literary work, that is built upon these kinds of rooted templates and patterns, so that everyone is using and repeating to practical purpose, not everyone, but like a newer version of the same kind of work and the same kind of agreed upon framework as in any discipline. And it's all very intelligible to itself and like predictably interconnected. That's not to say that fascinating work doesn't emerge from that context, but that's not what is going on in this book. And yeah, this book is sort of like not, apart from the fact that this is a book of writing that is about other writing, and I should say even that writing concept in terms of the novel is sometimes stretched, because we have here an essay on a Dennis Cooper novel that is composed entirely of GIFs. We have one on Twin Peaks. We have one on drawing as writing and writing as drawing. And maybe you'll get into like how this book kind of differently conceives of the novel as a concept. But there's really nothing of conventional literary criticism in the way these essays approach their subjects. And of course, there's a very rich tradition of like extra academic writing external to academia about writing. So I wouldn't even bother to characterize this as like a departure or a refusal of any kind, because that's just not among its set of concerns, I would say. It has an entirely different set of concerns, works that are under discussion, and the ideas that they ignite in the writer, that I think probably fall more accurately into like an experimental tradition, if I can use that word, or either of those words. So maybe we can start there, and you could talk about how the book might actually situate, because, like despite its being not part deliberately of an academic narrative, it is, as a thing in the world, invariably part of some other narratives.
Yeah, that's an incredibly collegial description of what's going on between these covers, and it's incredibly novel to say that, because a lot of this work was previously unpublished, and so much of it found different kinds of occasional contexts until we decided to make it into this object. So yeah, thank you for that. I think that this, there was a word, I sometimes talk about para-academic writing, because a lot of what I do is a little bit not downstream of the academy, and not in a position of adjacency per se, because I am an independent researcher and quite unaffiliated academically. Definitely since, I don't know, storming out of high school in a huff, I've found a few contexts for this writing that are, I suppose, furnished me by universities, conferences, and what have you. But this is something that's undertaken at quite a distance from what I don't have any particular disdain for, but I think is a notably private and proprietary kind of model of knowledge production. And a lot of the people that I'm writing about in this book, new narrative writers, all manner of experimental writers and experimental poets and so on. And this will probably recur throughout the conversation. It's hard to find an adjective that's suitable to this work, right? Is it experimental? Avant-garde is sort of, I like the resonance with vanguard thinking and so on, but it's a little touristic, isn't it? It's hard to find the right word. But anyway, this experimental writing, very often these I think really quite dazzling writers who were initially underappreciated by everyone except for their direct peers. New Narrative, for example, is, for those who might not be familiar with that material, typically glossed as a kind of queer experimental writing adjacent to language poetry that is more concerned with the body and sexuality and autobiography as furnishing the writer their primary materials. It's a very pro-social writing that originates from a very small writers' workshop in the Bay Area in the late 70s and early 80s. And these writers, in their relative obscurity or hermitage or what have you, had to sort of evolve their own critical apparatus apace of the wonderful fictions that they were creating for want of a larger reception, you know? So this is contemporary of maybe the English language reception of French theory and a lot of really rich Freudo-Marxist thought, but it's radically non-academic. It's happening in bookstores and apartments and really on the street, and even in I think queer spaces, gay bars. It's no less sophisticated than its institutional counterpart for being so. But it has a little bit of a Robin Hood intentionality, I think, at this moment of the Cold War. I'm going to pause for dramatic emphasis there. That's one of the watchwords of this text. Has a lot to do with Cold War, the word in one, again, it seems. At this moment of the Cold War, I think one of the contrivances of the ruling class in North America was to kind of let these radicals have at it in this cordoned space of the academy, you know, that they were like, oh yeah, they can proliferate fancy terminologies and they can initiate perhaps a very radical critique that's really not supposed to manifest at street level, you know, any kind of effect. It's isolated. It was I think I don't want to ascribe intention to it. Ideology transpires often in this way. It's difficult to attribute, but it was very, very, very bad, I think, for the left, that so much rich Marxist thinking was isolated from broad working class movements. In this same period that New Narrative emerges, it's after 68, it's after these student movements, it's trying to think of a different sort of, I think, intentionality and different possible avenues of reception for radical thinking. So that was a tremendous inspiration for me when I found these texts. Colin Smith, who's here, was locally a great ambassador to New Narrative and language writing in the Kootenai School of Writing in Canada, which appealed to my, punk rock alma mater, you know, this kind of DIY instinct. The KSW is a very kind of hardscrabble DIY, non-institutional site of knowledge production and experimental writing. And these are some of the points of inspiration or conflict, really, ideological conflict that made me think that I could do this kind of writing as a reader, you know, as a self-employed, freelance, extra academic, itinerant reader. That was a mouthful. I apologize.
I think you know, the breadth of your reading and the sort of like the vastness of the sources that you draw into all of your writing is one of the factors that in itself it forms a kind of grounding that allows for the particular type of writing that you do to, like, you know, function in a kind of exciting way. And I think I was really trying to think about how to describe what it is that makes this prose unique for the reader, because there will be many readers who may not have encountered the text under discussion. There will be many who will seek it out because of the text under discussion as well. But I think there's two main things, and they're both kind of are difficult to articulate, but one is the way that you get at a thought through writing, a kind of thinking through writing where the deliberateness, and though not like, not playfully, but not meandering either, with a kind of directness that is navigated by these personal locations of interest or obsession. You pull fragments that are these ignition points from that sphere that is broad, be these like historical or political or literary or theoretical or spatial even. And instead of laying out definitive connection, you enter into this process of placing these ideas and moments and observations together in these like unlikely, or if not unlikely, at least unanticipated for the reader, assemblages, and sort of proceed to take these routes through and around and draw, you know, further ideas by circulating these kind of like little idea masses that are formed, and the unexpectedness of those routes and sometimes the fragments themselves do something really fruitful, I think, for the cognition, in part because I think so much of what we read and what we expect from the essayistic form is what we expect to be reading. We read what we expect to be reading, and we habitually kind of fill in whatever it is that we expect to find. And this kind of writing pretty much like disallows that from the start. And so that is one thing, is sort of like structural kind of like matter. The other thing, which I guess is also structural, is the way that, and I think done with like an equal level of deliberateness. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but, or maybe you want to respond to the first thing first. I'm rambling.
I have nothing to say by way of correction. Please go on. Let's say I intend all this. Yeah, well, I think it's just inherently there, but who knows? I'm just one reader. I think you're kind of, sort of with deliberateness, using sound, the sounds of words, and cadences and sentences to create this sonorous thing, these like sequences of sonorous things that are pleasing to the ear. And, you know, one thing about pleasing the ear is that it coaxes meaning. But also, like, and kind of in parallel to that, just as powerfully as it can coax meaning, it can leave the meaning of words kind of in the dust to their sounds and like background meaning, so that you're momentarily, or like even more durationally, in some cases, kind of displacing the signification of language and allowing a different kind of resonance to dominate, dominance to resonate, both of those things. Yeah.
So those things together make for like a uniquely, you know, pleasurable experience, and maybe particularly to readers of poetry. Many people who will be listening know that you write poetry as well, and perhaps, you know, to those readers, because even though it does have this clear and informed and like almost indexical kind of thinking, it also has this very like strongly, and like in an idiosyncratic sense, associational and like multisensory aesthetic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that this text is probably guilty of poetry in some moments. I sometimes wonder if the writing isn't actually altogether too purple. But I'm sometimes attracted to that effectivity, and I will take that accusation should anyone else wish to level it. There's definitely a surplus, I think, of sound over meaning that sometimes carries some of these sentences, that maybe their persuasiveness might consist in that music, to an unseemly degree. But that's also, I mean, that's also presuming a lot. That's presuming that the book is persuasive in any respect. But I also hope that I can use some of those sonorous effects demonstratively, in that, for example, when I'm talking about a lot of complexly overdetermined material, there are lots of neither nor mechanisms, qualifying clauses, and so on along the way. And I kind of proliferate these alliterative couplets all over the place, And on one hand, that is, I guess that just betokens a surfeit of sound or poetry. But on the other hand, I think, and this is a claim, I would hope that that kind of assists a kind of a dialectical demonstration, where that those like sounds and some of the merely sonic resemblances between otherwise contradictory seeming concepts, words for concepts, maybe that is a good way to represent these dialectical eddies in the current, where contradiction appears between something and an instance of itself, if that makes sense, if that isn't too highfalutin. So it's a kind of onomatopoeia of the concept that I would aspire to, rather than a sort of distracting, ornamental, compulsive poetry. But it may also be those things. I'm a deeply compulsive person.
Yeah, I don't know. Are you thinking you might read something, or?
Yeah, I could read something. This is a tricky book to read from because, if you haven't gathered already, this is a collection of essays about other writing, and I won't presume conversancy in any one of these texts, and I hope that the book doesn't either. I hope, there's pretty pictures. There are long block quotes. I hope that I set everything up so that if there's an essay in here about a book that you haven't read, maybe you would read the essay and then wish to encounter the book. Maybe everything in here, and this might be a fit compliment. But one of the weird gambits in this book is I'm engaging with with a variety of Marxist literary criticism and a lot of writing about the novel. One name that recurs a lot is Lukács, a Hungarian literary critic, who privileged a kind of realist novel that isn't very well represented in these essays. I write a lot about experimental writing and more surrealistic, to be a little anachronistic in my terminology, writing that Lukács himself, I think, would hate, frankly. But his criteria for an exemplary Marxist, historical, materialist sort of novelism he privileged literary realism because he thought that it was apt to disclose a social totality and all of the contradictions and contradictory moments and points of view that encompasses. So there's a point over the course of these essays, and it's a tacit argument because they're all discrete essays, where I basically propose that a novel is an artistic index of the social totality, so that I can write about drawings and asemic writing. I can write about television programs and all kinds of things in this collection that's ostensibly about novels. And maybe the furthest that I stretch this, but this is an appropriate length to read aloud, is in this essay about the solar eclipse. It was written in 2018. I don't know if anyone saw the solar eclipse, and I hope you didn't look directly at it. But I'm not sure if I'm saying that the sun is a novel or what here, but this seemed like an appropriate thing maybe to read, even if it's a little atypical, because the Queen is dead, and we're in a bit of a moment of jubilee right now. So this is called In the Path of Totality. In moments of unbearable intensity, people are ever more alike. This final equality, however, is forestalled, even suppressed over our separate days, where collective interests are calendrically diffused, and our common element is condescended to, like the vapor to which it returns. These days, everybody talks about the weather, but the point is not to change it. As a prelude to a Gaian crisis theory, the political economy of Georges Bataille may be said to construe the market as a weather, insofar as both systems emanate from the irradiance of the sun, a life source and final limit. In drafting his general economy, this ultra-left librarian pornographer took pains to demonstrate its commensurability with the scale of cosmos. Again, the dependence of the economy on the circulation of energy on the earth, originating with and modeled on the sun's ceaseless beneficence. Minds accustomed to seeing the development of productive forces as the ideal end of activity refuse to recognize that energy which constitutes wealth must ultimately be spent lavishly without return, and that a series of profitable operations has absolutely no other effect than the squandering of profits. This thesis of the interconnectedness of all industry in the broadest sense falsifies enterprise and privacy alike, and furthermore tempts bodily retort. According to the global outplacement and executive coaching firm, Challenger Gray and Christmas Incorporated, 87.3 million workers across the United States of America were poised to cost the capitalist class $694 million during the total eclipse of August 2018. The estimated losses caused by a convivial 20-minute walkout in the works for 100, if not thousands of years. In 1133 CE, King Henry I of England died upon eating spoiled eel, apparently precipitating a total solar eclipse. This is true. This cathartic episode lasted for 4 minutes of darkness and mourning and opened onto many more of war, another favorite catastrophic expenditure of energy. But for those 240 seconds, there was only festival, the kind of giddy jubilee in which Bataille perceives an intimation of equality and continuity between persons, otherwise repressed, a revolutionary Saturnalia whilst kings decompose. No sooner than one conceives of a sovereign entity, self-evidence withstanding, its dispatch is conceptually assured. We know there is a sun, such that today we cannot meet its gaze. But this endurance foreshadows a properly unthinkable cessation. For as philosopher Jean-François Lyotard notes in a moment of teleological fury, puerile, yet irrefutably correct, the death of the sun is a death of mind, beyond which there is no correlate to thought. As our sun will burn out in some 5 billion years, one might say that the universal mind marks a kind of post-dated oblivion too. In the interminable meantime, the industrial sun remains a model of production for production's sake. For 14 days in March 2017, the state of Arizona was gifted free power by its neighbor, California. And this was not the first time either. On another sunny day in 2017, Germany produced so much renewable energy that power prices went negative, such that people were effectively paid to consume. This doesn't quite corroborate Bataille's pronouncement that as energy transformed, our future communism ought to model itself on destructive excess. The colonial problematic of the Anthropocene prohibits any merely orgiastic praxis. Anarcho-gluttony on behalf of whom? Describing himself as a drop of sun under the earth, philosopher Frantz Fanon refuses the acculturated curse of racism for an identification so general that it bypasses the colonizer's edict in its otherworldliness. In this poetic description, the author figures not as reflective consciousness, but as refracted life force. We should bear this identity in mind when, in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon speaks of reclaiming resources from the colonizer, to re-examine the soil and mineral resources, the rivers, and why not the sun's productivity. Indeed, why not? As utopian technocrats optimistically report, world energy needs could be met in solar power using only 1.2% of the surface area of the Sahara Desert. But American experts have peculiarly selective definitions of both world and need, as befits the interests of an imperial core. Final consumers of the sun's energy could never be final enough. If scarcity is simply the result of stymied synthesis, we may need yet another sun, one for the working and the wretched. Can we start to regard our star as such an ancient novelty today? In a poetic inventory of upsetting consummations, Bataille identifies the fiery annulus of the eclipse with the anus of night. The sun's rays find their ready, greedy counterpart in restless masses. The eclipse burns in the mirror of our eyes. Desire redeems indecency. Then it is good not to succumb to the technical illusion that we die as we dream, irredeemably separate. Anything can prompt a walkout, and should the sun cease to provide for everyone, why not blot it out and start again?
Nice. No walkouts, so no walkouts, yeah. So we don't have too much time remaining, but I wonder whether, and maybe this casts back a bit to the questions raised by Lukáš, but the political position of this kind of writing and being work that is rooted in radicality or leftist politics, as as I said earlier, it's structurally made up of these ultimately productive, investigatory tributaries, and the reader is in for, as I said, something that they're not necessarily going to be able to anticipate. And I'm curious about what kind of that kind of entrance to ideas does to the development of thought, maybe specifically political thought for the reader. It certainly does a lot for the writer, it seems like, you know, this is amplifying kind of process. But Toby Hazlitt in his endorsement calls this book a testament to the force and beauty of Marxist thinking, writing, fighting. And I think, again, we're not talking about Marxism as sometimes deployed in academia, where it tends to be self-circulating and self-contained, and therefore you can kind of like maybe even diversional to its own thesis. But as a kind of like in the realm of fighting, which is action, of thought that both leads to and is a part of action. And so this question of what relationship or position experimental writing has in radical struggle rears up. And, you know, 5 minutes, but like, I'm curious what you're feeling is that on that as like, as it manifests in the book, which I think you've already dwelt upon a bit, but maybe also as a writer who is an organizer and involved directly in various like social movements and political action for change.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to untangle all of that in 5 minutes. I'm going to figure out the co-imbrication, the parallax of aesthetics and politics. Yeah, that's a big question. Toby flatters me with that triplet. I really like it. Thinking, writing, fighting. You know, how could we make those coincide? Because they don't practically coincide. Do you know the time in which these were written? Not because you and I assembled this book in a polite year. The oldest moments of these demonstrations are from 2013, maybe. The time of this writing is quite different from the time of organizing and struggle and the epiphanic time, the really exhilarating sort of collective experience of politics that some of us might have had at various moments of time in the last couple of years. It is different, but articulated. So one way of approaching this, for me, I mentioned that some of this stuff is now coming up on 9 years old, and some of it is so fresh. Really, I mean, we were going back and forth about it right before we had to send this off, and possibly even later, I'm sorry. How does my thinking about the relationship between art and politics, never mind my art and my politics, change over the course of that writing? Do you know, in that time, I did all kinds of things that I would encourage that I think were salutary developments for myself. I got plugged back into community organizing in Winnipeg on Treaty 1, where I was born when I came back from New York. I joined a party. I have learned a lot in that time. And what does that do for this writing? I think that some of the earliest articulations of the relationship between art, which is to say representation, and politics, which crudely, let's say that means reality, in this book, early on, I think I have more of a prefigurative sort of idea of art, that it's an imaginary practice that can help us project into a future that doesn't as yet exist, and it can help us to imagine better, more peaceable ways of being and organizing life. And its power is that it helps our political imagination along. And that strikes me as one-sided or kind of idealist now. And by the end of this project, I think that my idea of the relationship between art and politics is that artworks represent, they represent reality. They represent the social totality to which they are beholden, and they represent a determinate, partial, so obliged stake. It has a class dimension in the existing society. So they are totally derived. And I think that both of those things are true. And what I hope happens over the course of this book is that there's this moment of sort of dialectical repair, where the reason why art can help us to imagine other worlds is because all of the material that it's refashioning is directly derived from the society that we live in, you know? So it's a way of actually handling and experimenting with, I'm tempted by an almost scientistic proposition here. It's a medium in which we can experiment with the social materials that we do inhabit when we are totally circumscribed by. Go in like a minute, but in the preface, I say something here that I'm just going to read quickly. If this collection has a through line, it would be the conviction that because every work of art is socially beholden, literature discloses something of the world and politics upon which it depends. Beyond a standard symptomatic treatment that construes art as passively reflective of surroundings, rendering criticism a practice of recovering past presentisms, these essays were written in the belief that the material determinations of an artwork, literary or otherwise, manifest a conscious form of which disparate subjects partake. Artworks help us think about the world, not as a go-to agreement, but as modules of consciousness, a word for when the world appears to a knowing participant. As literature can model social transformation, these pieces have two theses in common: that thought is not private and nothing should be. The first of these is axiomatic and presumes the subject of thought to be constituted in and by language. The second issues a demand for a better world, prefigured by the general intellect of which this work joyfully partakes. So I don't think that answers the question.
Part of the discussion. But also a really great encapsulation of what the book does, which is like really joyful and investigative kind of celebration of both art and politics. So the time tells me that it is now that we open to questions. Yeah, unless there's more that you want to talk about. There's lots I could talk about.
I'll take questions, comments, concerns.
The only thing I will point out just before the Q&A begins is that for the benefit of all those at home, I'm going to wander around and ask you to ask me your question, which I will then repeat into the microphone. So we'll play a very elaborate game of telephone to get to Cam. One thing I should point out is that my brain is essentially porridge after these last few months. So if you could keep your questions relatively succinct, you'll have ample opportunity to both interrogate and hector Cam when we move along to the signing at the end of the event. Jeannie.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. In your thinking about Lukács, did you ever find yourself wishing you could revise some of his propositions, and if so, which?
When you were thinking about Lukács, did you ever find yourself thinking that you would like to revise some of his propositions? And if so, which?
Yeah, that's a great question because, you know, he was in anguish over this same thing. He revised his propositions all the time and you know, somewhat reneged on, I think, many of his most exciting projects, and then later on kind of tried to double back and be like, no, I was wrong when I said I was wrong. You know, this is dialectical, maybe, however otherwise coerced. But yeah, absolutely. There's an essay in here, and I won't go on it at too great a length, which I'd originally presented. The germ of this idea was presented at the Philadelphia Avant-Garde Studies Consortium. And the essay is called Limited Omniscience and Militant Secrecy. And this is where I try to tease out some of the limitations or the contradictions of Lukács's endorsement of literary realism, right? And I get into this what I specifically want to do, to give a quick answer to that question, what I really want to do is finesse this encounter between Lukács and Ernst Bloch. It's quite a famous dust-up, you know, where Lukács writes against avant-garde literature, right? And he has his own kind of idiosyncratic terms for different modernisms, naturalism, surrealism, and what have you. He hates James Joyce, and he thinks that that basically the avant-garde is systematizing or preserving or giving undue emphasis to what are psychological disturbances resulting from like ideological states of flux. You know, the world is in crisis, and maybe a lot of people here have read the Lukács essay, and perhaps I'm paraphrasing it. So he doesn't like these psychological, expressivist, experimental literatures because he thinks they're captive of a single perspective, which is itself symptomatic of capitalist crisis, you know? And Bloch's retort is that the discontinuous kind of fabric of this text is also a picture of reality, of authentic reality. So very briefly, what I hope to do, and there's a real impasse between them, and I so don't achieve this. It's just a stumper, and I admire both of these thinkers equally for the way that they responded to their moment. You know, I think of the individual and all of their signs and symptoms and reflexes and their interiority as like totally socially derived, you know? And I think of the deeply interior expressivist avant-garde literatures as just kind of a cognitive map of the social totality kind of turned in on itself. And I don't think I synthesize them really very well at all, but that's the dream.
Cody was wondering if you had any thoughts on the political economy of solar storms and the threat to communication systems.
Oh, wow. Well, for another project, I was delving into the archive of Coast to Coast the other night, and collaging all sorts of these preposterous theories. And someone was talking about solar storms, but I won't get into the paranormal. I don't have a turned out theory of that, but I think, you know, I think that if something equivalent to a great walkout or strike or something like that is initiated by an interstellar entity, a solar storm or whatever, I think we should all be ready to seize the moment. 2024.
Thank you, Cody. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, yes. Yes.
I guess could you ask Gail if you could talk a little bit about the different communities, like reading communities that he's personally been part of that have brought these different works and engaged with
Cam, could you speak on the different reading communities that you have been a part of that have brought these works to your attention, that you've interacted?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Oh, because it gets a little abstract at a point, right? That I keep saying, oh, this is about literature and social states, the social totality, social, without specifying societies and companies. So those are so many. Those are so many. I mean, do you know there's a great, yeah, let me try to shout these out in maybe not quite a chronological order, but my first sense that people could sort of refashion the material of the world that they lived in directly and get their hands dirty and undertake to change things in their immediate surroundings was in punk. I was playing in bands with my friends and traveling and so on. And then that carried over into my experience of the writing scene here in Winnipeg, principally concerned with poetry, but also I mentioned the Kootenai School of Writing, I think on the West Coast there. My dear friend Colin introduced me to a lot of those texts, and they're practitioners. And that to me had a very similar kind of impetus to punk, but was dealing with the most abstruse theory and it was similarly politically committed. So that was a very exhilarating context that, I kind of followed down the West Coast or whatever to New Narrative. Kevin Killian and Dodi Bellamy gave me a very warm reception there. And a lot of the texts that I'm directly concerned with in this book there are 2 essays about Kevin Killian's writing. I implore all of you, if you haven't read Kevin, he's someone who incarnated and facilitated community everywhere he went, with his generosity of spirit and just his weird inclusionist aesthetic. Everything is in those books. So they're absolutely perverted. You should check out Kevin Killian. And then, I spent some time in New York. I was working at a bookstore there, and the poetry scene in New York would not, how to say, there's so many little corners of it, right? But a lot of these texts were solicited by Kay Gabriel, Hayden Bennett. There are too many names to shout out, but close conspirators thereabouts. More recently, and it's interesting because this is not a place where I do writing or theory at all, quite the opposite, but a lot of really important conversations have come from participation in socialist politics and in the Communist Party over the last couple of years. So grassroots organizing in Winnipeg as well, Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, has furnished so many good friendships, and they're just doing really incredible work. The list goes on and on, but I really can't enumerate the communities. We're in McNally Robinson right now. I worked here for more than a decade, and probably special ordered most of the books that I write about here while I was working here. And I could go on and on, but that's some of them. ARP Books. Yeah.
Yes, Henry.
You're dealing with these texts here. I was reading the first essay, and this guy seems really interesting. And there's this kind of we're dealing with sort of literature which is on sort of the extreme edge of things, which I'm very interested in, hoping to learn more about it. But you mentioned Lukács and the fact that he was very hostile to this sort of experimentalism. He hated Brecht, and Brecht's solution to that was to sort of be experimental, but also he had this idea of distancing, and he tried to make the aesthetic moment into a didactic moment. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Is it possible, or do these texts have to stand for themselves, or in what way can one sort of use them as social critique?
Yeah, that's a great question. Brecht, almost whenever Brecht enters into how to say conflict with anyone, I'm probably Team Brecht. I'm very fond of Brecht, but yeah, his wisdom, as I understand it, is to point out one of the reasons why I think he's so interested in the capacity of artworks to kind of interrupt themselves and jam themselves and run interference on themselves and point out aspects of their own formal presentation and hopefully onto an educative, politically salutary moment, right? Is because I think he's absolutely correct about, and this is directly contra Lukács, you know, that artistic forms are themselves products of the history that they depict and the historical moment that they depict. And there can be a too easy kind of agreement, you know, of like form and content in the sense that these forms are of a time and a place, you know. So as for the didactic aspect of Brecht, I really admire the ethics that propelled that work. Do you know that his plays are teaching? They're teaching the audience. I saw an incredible production of The Mother in New York. The Wooster Group did The Mother, which is, if you don't know the play by Brecht, it's set after, it's more around 1905. It's before the Russian Revolution. And what happens over the course of this play is a young radical, against her initial resistance, brings his mother along into this organizing, you know, and she starts organizing people and becomes a convinced social democrat at this point, socialist. And at one point she is, I think they're printing and distributing newspapers, I can't recall, in the offices or the apartment of this quite conservative teacher who was initially horrified to discover this, and then they kind of bring him along. So you see how intellectuals and students and parents and people of all different generations and offices in life are eventually brought along in the momentum of this organizing over the course of the play. So you're watching in this teaching play, you're watching people learn, and you're watching people train each other in politics at the same time as the audience is being trained in politics. And it was just one of the most incredible productions I've ever seen of a very, very interesting text. So it's cool that what's happening on stage is maybe ideally happening between the audience and the performers. In a lot of the texts under examination here, you know, this is one of the benefits of what I was talking about before, where I kind of maybe moved from thinking that these works are imaginative sort of feats over against reality to a point where I think more that they are in some ways these derived maps. You know, a lot of the writing in this book doesn't seem politically actionable. If you were to try to extrapolate a morality, I guess of ethics more properly, from a lot of these texts, Sadian literatures and very bizarre transgressive stuff, you might wind up in a lot of trouble. But you know, all of the incidental signs comprising these works, I think, because they are socially derived we can make political extrapolations from them, even if the texts themselves are kind of unseemly. So, yeah, I would say that these texts are not, what's interesting is that these texts very often teach nothing, and I'm still trying to see what there is to be learned, you know, about even about politics from some quite thorny, political, antisocial works of transgressive art as well. That was a little meandering, I apologize, but that's a great question.
Thank you very much, Ken. We are just at the just past the top of the hour, so if you folks have any closing comments you might like to offer, I'll then return with some thrilling signing procedural notes.
Surely those were my closing comments. Nobody wants to hear another word from me.
Yeah, I don't really have any closing comments other than to thank Cam for the conversation and for publishing another book with ARP, and to thank everyone who has come out on this rainy day and those watching at home.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's what I'll say. Thanks to ARP Books and Irene. There really isn't a more hospitable venue, and I can't imagine this wouldn't exist without you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you both very much. We'll now be moving along to the signing portion of the evening. So I'll ask you all just to remain seated for one moment as we safely transport Cam across the store to a table just beside the cash desk. There are copies of the Vanishing Signs there. There are copies of Roman's SNOWMARE. We also have copies of the essay collection at the cash desk. You can get a copy signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book at some point or other. In reference to an earlier comment as well, too, one of the most brilliant things about this book is that it sits at the intersection of so many different underground streams that it's a book you absolutely read pen in hand, and it just opens so many incredible new avenues of inquiry. So not only is it just incredibly nourishing work in its own right, it's so incredibly generative, and it's a fascinating book. So we're particularly thrilled to be launching it here tonight for that and many other reasons. So thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight, both here and virtually. A huge thanks to Irene Bindi for not only hosting this event, but editing the volume and making sure it came out into the world. So applause for Irene. To all the good folks at ARP Books, and of course, to Cam Scott. Thank you all very much, and have a good night.